Savannah, Georgia. The year is 1847. To the casual observer, Savannah was a city of almost dreamlike beauty, a carefully composed painting of Southern grace. Grand homes with pristine white columns stood in stately rows, their verandas draped in the delicate lacework of cast iron. Ancient oaks, heavy with Spanish moss that hung like the beards of sleek old men, formed shaded canopies over cobblestone squares. The air, thick and sweet, carried the scent of magnolia blossoms and the salty tang of the nearby river. It was a city that performed its elegance with theatrical flair, a place where civility was not just a virtue but an art form. But this performance, like all great theater, was built upon a hidden, brutal reality. To understand the madness that took root in the Harrow plantation, one must first lift this beautiful veil and peer into the darkness beneath. Savannah in 1847 was a city of exquisite, dangerous contradictions. The wealth that funded its architectural splendor and opulent social life was extracted from the mud of rice paddies and the dusty rows of cotton fields. All of it planted, tended, and harvested by the hands of enslaved men, women, and children. The same gentle breeze that carried the scent of magnolias also carried the sounds from the slave market, the stench of the crowded shipping ports, and the ever-present threat of yellow fever, a disease that could sweep through the city in the summer heat and turn the most beautiful homes into quarantine zones overnight. There were rules, unspoken yet as binding as any law written on paper. These rules governed every facet of life for the city's elite. They dictated how a gentleman conducted business, how a lady managed her household, how one expressed joy, and most importantly, how one performed grief. Reputation was a currency more valuable than gold, and a public scandal was a form of social death from which there was no recovery. This rigid social order was a fortress designed to protect the fragile illusion of a perfect, God-fearing world, all while ignoring the profound moral rot at its foundation. It was a world that demanded its people be actors playing their assigned roles with flawless conviction. And it was in this gilded cage that the Harrow family resided. Their plantation, situated a few miles outside the city's suffocating propriety, was poetically named Serenity Fields. But serenity was a concept alien to its grounds. There was only order, the unbending, absolute, and often cruel order of its master, Alistair Harrow. Alistair was not a product of Savannah's old money aristocracy, and this fact was the driving force of his existence. He was a self-made man, a status he simultaneously wielded as a weapon against his rivals, and concealed as a deep-seated shame among the city's established elite. His father had been a crude but ruthlessly successful merchant who had amassed a fortune but never the respect that Alistair craved. Alistair inherited his father's business acumen but coated it in a polished veneer of old-world class that he had desperately and often awkwardly cultivated. He bought Serenity Fields not merely for its fertile land, but for its pedigree, its history. He mastered the arts of the Southern gentleman, the precise etiquette of a formal dinner, the subtle language of horsemanship, the intricate dance of cotton futures with the same obsessive efficiency he applied to his financial ledgers. His will was the governing law of his domain. He walked his property with a heavy, purposeful stride, his gaze missing nothing. The rows of cotton were perfectly aligned, the fences meticulously maintained, the slave quarters functional and brutally efficient, designed to house bodies, not nurture lives. The manor house itself was a monument to his control. Every chair, every piece of silver, every book in his leather-bound library was placed according to his unyielding design. He was a man who did not tolerate chaos in any form. He did not manage it, he eliminated it. His temper, a storm rarely unleashed in public, was a thing of legend among the enslaved, a force of nature that could erupt over a misplaced tool or a dusty windowsill. And then there was Mrs. Alistair Harrow. If Alistair was the architect of this rigid world, Elara was its most perfect and most tragic ornament. She was not born to this life of immense wealth. She was the daughter of a respectable Charleston family whose name carried more weight than their purse. Her marriage to Alistair Harrow at the tender age of 18 was, in the eyes of the world, a spectacular success. It was a union that secured her family's precarious future and elevated her to the very apex of Savannah society. In truth, it was a transaction, and in this transaction, Elara's soul was the currency. Alistair did not desire a partner. He desired a centerpiece. He saw in her a beautiful, malleable vessel into which he could pour his ideals of a plantation mistress. From the moment of their marriage, he began a slow, methodical process of sculpting her. He chose her gowns, favoring somber colors and modest cuts that bespoke dignity over flash. He corrected her speech, smoothing her Charleston accent into the more clipped, authoritative tones of Savannah's elite. He dictated her social engagements, curating her friendships to include only those who could advance his own standing. Her own opinions, if she still possessed them, were folded away like old linens and stored in the dark attic of her mind. Over a decade, she became a flawless extension of his will, a quiet, graceful automaton who managed his home with a precision that mirrored his own. Society praised her for her poise, her serenity, her unimpeachable character. No one seemed to notice, or perhaps no one cared, that this placid serenity was indistinguishable from a profound and terrifying emptiness. Her world was the house. Her purpose was Alistair. The fact that they remained childless was a subject of hushed gossip among the ladies of Savannah, a subtle but significant crack in the perfect facade of their lives, and a source of deep, unspoken disappointment for a man so obsessed with creating a lasting legacy. For Elara, this childlessness only served to narrow her world further, her entire existence revolving around the maintenance of her husband's home and his comfort. Her life was a performance, and she was playing the part of Mrs. Alistair Harrow. After 10 years, the role had utterly consumed the actress. She had no friends of her own, only his associates. She had no interests of her own, only his passions. Her thoughts, it seemed, were mere echoes of his pronouncements. The enslaved staff of the house learned to navigate the strange, silent weather of this dynamic. They knew the master's moods, the rumble of his approaching anger, his thunderous rages over perceived slights. And they knew the mistress's silence. It was a different kind of authority, not one of power, but of absence. Among them was a young woman named Hattie. She had been born at Serenity Fields, her world from its first breath circumscribed by the will of the Harrows. As a housemaid, she had been trained to be invisible, to see and hear everything while appearing to see and hear nothing. It is only through the story she would later carry, a secret held as tight as a prayer for decades, that we have any account of what happened next. She was the unwilling audience to the play's final, horrifying act. The inciting incident, the moment the world of Serenity Fields began to fracture, arrived with the fury of a Georgia thunderstorm. In May of 1847, the sky turned a bruised, sickly purple. The air grew heavy and still, the oppressive humidity a prelude to the coming violence. The rains came not gently, but in great lashing sheets that turned the roads to impassable mud and the fields into shallow lakes. Alistair Harrow, ignoring the concerned warnings of his overseer, insisted on riding out to inspect a drainage ditch on the far side of his property. He was a master horseman, a man who believed his will could conquer the elements as easily as it could a line of accounting. He was wrong. His horse, a powerful black stallion as proud as its owner, was spooked by a sudden deafening crack of lightning that split a nearby tree. It bolted, wild with terror. For the first time in his life, Alistair Harrow lost control. He was thrown, his body hurled with brutal force against the unyielding trunk of an ancient oak. His death was not a gentle fading, but a brutal, instantaneous affair. The master of Serenity Fields, the man who had bent an entire world to his will, was found broken and lifeless in the mud. His reign ended not by a business rival or a slave rebellion, but by a random, meaningless act of chaos, the very thing he had spent his life trying to eliminate. The news spread through Savannah like a virus. The machinery of southern morning, always well-oiled, sprang into motion. Society, ever prepared for such performances, donned the collective mask of grief. The funeral was a masterclass in ritual. A long, slow procession of black carriages wound its way to the churchyard. A eulogy delivered by a man who had feared Alistair more than he had liked him spoke of a titan of industry, a pillar of the community. Through it all, Elara stood at the graveside, her figure shrouded in a heavy black veil, her posture perfectly erect, her silence absolute. She was the very picture of the devastated yet dignified widow. Many remarked on her incredible strength, her composure in the face of such tragedy. They mistook the blankness of profound shock for fortitude. They mistook a complete system overload for grace. The final carriage rolled away from Serenity Fields, its wheels crunching on the gravel drive. The heavy oak door of the manor closed, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing through the unnaturally quiet halls. The performance was over. The guests were gone. The house, once a stage for Alistair's life, was now just a silent, empty building. Alistair Harrow was, for the first time in her adult life, utterly and completely alone, and in that moment faced with an existence that had lost its center, its author, its very reason for being. She did not enter a period of grief. She did not weep. She did not collapse. Instead, she made a choice. She chose not to. The door was not just closed, it was sealed. And inside that silent house, Alistair Harrow began the slow, meticulous process of constructing a new reality, one built upon a foundation of terrifying, unshakable denial. The slow, creeping madness had found fertile ground. The days following Alistair Harrow's funeral were marked by a series of quiet yet deeply unsettling changes that began to ripple through Serenity Fields. The first directive was given to the staff, not by Elara herself, but through a note passed to the overseer. The field hands were to continue their work as usual, their lives of toil uninterrupted. The house slaves, however, received a different, more bewildering command. All of them, the cook, the footman, the upstairs maids, were to be dismissed from the main house indefinitely. They were to return to their quarters and await further instruction. There was no explanation, no reason given. The house, once a bustling hub of activity, fell into a profound and unnerving silence. Elara's world was shrinking, the walls of her own making closing in around her. Only one was ordered to remain, Hattie. Her duties were now simple, specific, and strange. She was to maintain the master bedroom and the grand dining room. Nothing more. The rest of the sprawling mansion was to be sealed. Hattie was tasked with the solemn, ghostly work of draping the fine furnishings in white dust sheets, transforming the once vibrant home into a ghostly landscape of shrouded shapes. As she moved silently through the halls, the familiar fear she had felt in the master's presence was replaced by something new and far more insidious. It was a slow, cold dread that seemed to seep from the very walls of the house. The fear of the unknown. The first truly horrifying command, the one that would irrevocably shatter the boundary between grief and madness, came on the third day. Elara summoned Hattie not with a bell, but by appearing at the kitchen door like an apparition. Her face was a pale, emotionless mask. She beckoned Hattie to follow her down to the cellar. The cellar at Serenity Fields was a dark, cool space, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and aging wine. In a small, stone-lined room at the back, a space normally used for preserving meats, Alistair's body had been kept on a marble slab for the viewing. The city undertaker had done his work preparing the body for its final journey to the family plot. But Elara had a different journey in mind. Her voice, when she spoke, was devoid of any recognizable emotion. It was the same calm, directive tone she might use when instructing a servant to polish silver or arrange flowers. She told Hattie to go upstairs and fetch the master's finest evening suit, the one of black wool with the dark silk lapels, and his favorite cravat, and his polished leather shoes. Hattie stood frozen, paralyzed by a confusion so deep it bordered on terror. The command made no sense, but the look in her mistress's eyes was one of serene, unshakable certainty. A slave's protest or even a moment of hesitation was an invitation to punishment, or worse. She was property and her function was obedience, no matter how insane the command. With trembling hands, Hattie did as she was told. Together, in the chilling silence of the cellar, the two women began the grotesque task of dressing the dead man. Hattie's hands shook uncontrollably as she handled the cold, stiff limbs, the unnatural weight of a body without life. Elara, by contrast, was methodical. Her movements were precise, almost reverent, as she corrected a wrinkle in the sleeve, adjusted the cravat just so, and worked his feet into the polished shoes. She looked upon her work not with the anguish of a widow, but with the focused, critical eye of a valet preparing his master for an important evening. When she was finally satisfied, she stepped back, appraised the figure on the slab, and gave the next order, an order that would cement Hattie's role as the unwilling keeper of a terrifying secret. Alistair Harrow was not taken to his grave. He was taken to the dining room. Using a small servant's cart and all of their combined strength, they moved the body. The scraping of the cart's wheels on the polished wood floors was the only sound in the dead-silent house. It was a slow, nightmarish procession up the cellar stairs and down the main hall. They placed him at the head of the long mahogany table in his usual high-backed chair, the chair from which he had presided over every family meal, every business dinner, every moment of his domestic reign. Elara then spent nearly an hour adjusting him, propping him up with carefully placed cushions hidden beneath his suit jacket, arranging his limbs until he looked from a distance in the dim light merely asleep. Or perhaps deep in thought. That evening, the ritual began. At precisely 6 o'clock, the time Alistair had always demanded supper. A small silver bell chimed through the house. It was Elara summoning Hattie to the kitchen. Hattie was instructed to prepare a full 3-course meal, roast chicken, seasonal vegetables, fresh bread, and to decant a bottle of the master's favorite French wine. She was then to set the table. For two, Elara descended the grand staircase not in the black weeds of mourning, but in a dark silk evening gown. She was dressed for dinner with her husband. She took her seat at the table, unfolded her linen napkin, and looked expectantly toward the kitchen. She nodded to Hattie. "You may serve us now," she said, her voice a perfect imitation of normalcy. Hattie, her body moving on autopilot while her mind screamed, brought the first course. She placed one plate of food before her mistress, then, with her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure Elara could hear it, she approached the head of the table. She placed the other plate before the slunt, unmoving figure of Alistair Harrow. Elara began to eat, and then in the suffocating silence she began to speak. She spoke to him as she always had, or rather as he had always allowed her to speak. delivering a quiet, one-sided report of the day. The overseer had sent word that the lower field was draining well. A letter had arrived from a cousin in Charleston. The weather was expected to be fair tomorrow. Her voice, thin and steady, was the only sound in the cavernous room. A fragile thread of supposed sanity weaving a tapestry of utter madness. The corpse, of course, did not reply. His silence, once a tool of intimidation and control, was now a blank canvas onto which Elara projected whatever she wished to hear. After an appropriate interval, Hattie was instructed to clear the first course, including Alistair's full untouched plate, and bring the second, then the third, then the dessert. The ritual was performed with all the solemnity of a religious rite. At the end of the meal, Elara would dab her lips with her napkin and rise. "It was a lovely supper, my dear," she would murmur to the empty air where his gaze should have been. Then she would gracefully ascend the stairs, leaving Hattie alone in the candlelight to clear the remaining dishes and face the silent, awful occupant of the head chair. The days bled into a week, then two. The routine never varied. The house remained sealed, a self-contained universe of delusion. For Hattie, life became a waking nightmare from which there was no escape. She slept in a small, windowless room off the kitchen, her sleep plagued by dreams of the silent, staring master. The dining room, once the proud heart of the house, became a place of profound and stomach-churning dread. And soon the smell began. It was the first sign that Elara's fabricated reality was beginning to collide with the unyielding physical laws of nature. The oppressive Georgia heat trapped inside the shuttered house was an enemy to preservation. A subtle, sickly sweet odor began to emanate from the dining room. At first it was faint, like the smell of wilting flowers left too long in a vase, mingled with something deeper, more primal, the smell of decay. Hattie noticed it immediately. It clung to the heavy velvet curtains, to the fabric of her own dress. Elara at first seemed oblivious, lost in the perfection of her ritual. But as the smell grew more potent, becoming a tangible presence in the house, she could no longer ignore it. But she did not confront the truth. Instead, she adapted her delusion to accommodate it. She instructed Hattie to burn incense throughout the day. Sticks of strong, cloying sandalwood and frankincense filled the house with a thick, aromatic haze. She had Hattie place bowls of potpourri and freshly cut, powerfully scented roses from the neglected garden on the sideboard. When that was not enough, she opened a vial of her most expensive French perfume and placed it on the table next to her husband's wine glass, as if it were simply another part of the formal place setting. The dining room, once a symbol of order and elegance, was becoming a fragrant tomb. For Elara, these measures were not a desperate attempt to mask the horrifying truth. They were simply household management. In her fractured mind, her husband was not rotting. He was merely unwell, and it was her wifely duty to make him comfortable. The psychological break was now complete. She was no longer performing for society. She was performing for an audience of one, and he was the ghost of her own desperate creation. Hattie was the sole witness to the theater of the grotesque. It was she who saw the subtle, horrifying changes in the master's body. The slow, inexorable slackening of the jaw which Elara would gently correct after her meal, propping it up with a carefully folded napkin. The slight discoloration of the skin on his hands, which Elara addressed by having Hattie fetch his fine leather gloves and place them on him. And then the arrival of the flies. At first there was just one, a buzzing speck drawn by the scent of death, then two. Soon a small, buzzing cloud that Hattie would desperately try to wave away with a frantic, silent motion before Elara entered the room for supper. The horror for Hattie was not just the sight or the smell. It was the crushing weight of her complicity. She was no longer just a witness, she was a participant. Every plate she served, every curtain she drew, every stick of incense she lit was an act of collaboration in this madness. To refuse was not an option. It would mean enraging the only authority left in her world, an authority that had completely detached from reality. What would a woman who keeps her dead husband at the dinner table do to a slave who disobeyed her? The question was too terrifying to contemplate. And so Hattie served the dead man day after day, her prayers for a deliverance she could not possibly engine growing more desperate with every passing silent meal. A world as self-contained and hermetic as the one Elara had built. A universe with a population of two, one living and one dead, cannot survive forever. The outside world, with its relentless timetables, its social obligations, and its expectations, eventually intrudes. The intrusion, in this case, came in the form of Elara's older brother, Thomas Devereux, a pragmatic and somewhat weary Charleston merchant. Thomas had always viewed his sister's marriage with a degree of quiet unease. He knew Alistair Harrow was a cold, exacting, and domineering man, and over the years he had watched his once vivacious younger sister slowly fade into a pale, silent reflection of her husband's will. He had accepted it as the way of the world, a woman's lot in a society that valued obedience over spirit. But he had never stopped caring for her in his own reserved way. Following the news of Alistair's death, he had done what was proper. He had sent 3 letters of condolence and inquiry, penned in his neat, sloping hand. He offered his support, his assistance in settling Alistair's complex affairs, and his comfort in her time of grief. He expected a reply, however brief. He received nothing. This was not entirely unusual in a period of formal mourning, but as the weeks stretched from 1 to 5, his concern began to curdle into genuine alarm. No word, no acknowledgement. It was as if Serenity Fields and his sister within it had fallen off the face of the earth. Against the advice of his wife, who counseled him to respect Elara's grieving period, Thomas booked passage on a coastal steamer to Savannah. A knot of nameless dread had tightened in his stomach. He needed to see for himself that his sister was well. When his carriage turned onto the long, oak-lined drive of Serenity Fields, his alarm escalated to a state of profound dread. The plantation, which he had always known as a model of perfect, almost sterile order, looked utterly abandoned. The normally manicured gardens were choked with weeds. The white paint of the porch railings was beginning to peel. A palpable, unnatural silence hung over the estate, broken only by the cawing of crows. He approached the grand front door and knocked, the sound echoing flatly in the still air. He knocked again, louder this time, his fist hammering against the solid oak. There was no response. He called his sister's name, his voice sounding small and foreign in the oppressive quiet. Only the rustle of dead leaves in the humid air answered him. He began to circle the house, his anxiety mounting with every step. He tried the windows, the side doors, the French doors leading to the veranda. All were bolted fast from within. A deep, primal fear began to take hold. He imagined his sister lost in a fog of grief, having done harm to herself. His mind raced through a dozen terrible scenarios: sickness, suicide, a tragic accident within the sealed house. Yet none could prepare him for the reality he was about to uncover. Finding a low window in what he knew to be Alistair's study, he used the heavy brass butt of his walking stick to break the glass. The sharp shatter of the pane was a shocking violation of the sense. He carefully reached in, unlatched the window, and hoisted himself inside. The moment he landed on the floor of the study, the smell hit him. It was an unholy, complex trinity of scents, an olfactory assault that defied easy description. There was the cloying, almost suffocating sweetness of incense and potpourri, a desperate attempt to mask something. Beneath that was the scent of rotting flowers, the smell of life and decay, and under it all, a deep, pervasive, and unmistakable stench. It was the sweet, nauseating smell of putrefaction, the smell of the grave. Brought indoors, it was thick, gagging, a tangible presence in the air. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it to his mouth and nose, his eyes watering. He called out for Elara again, his voice hoarse and muffled by the cloth. From somewhere deep within the house, from the direction of the main hall, he heard a faint sound. It was not a cry for help or a word of greeting. It was a single, soft, sibilant word. Hush! He followed the sound, and the source of the smell, which grew exponentially stronger as he moved through the darkened hall, his boots echoing on the floorboards. The trail of decay led him inexorably to the dining room. The great double doors usually left open were closed. He paused, his hand hovering over the brass handle, a terrible premonition washing over him. He took a deep breath of the foul air, held it, and threw the doors open. The sight that greeted him was an assault on sanity, a scene plucked from a madman's nightmare. The room was a cave of shadows, lit only by a single multi-branched candelabra on the table, its flickering light throwing grotesque dancing shadows on the walls. At the far end of the table in her usual seat sat Elara. She was pale, almost translucent, a spectral figure in the gloom. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the candlelight, looked up, startled by his violent intrusion. And then his gaze was drawn as if by a physical force to the chair opposite her. The head of the table, at first it was just a shape in the gloom, a man in a dark suit. But as his eyes struggled to adjust, the horror clarified itself with sickening detail. The fine wool suit hung loosely on a shrunken skeletal frame. The face was sunken, the skin a discolored, waxy parchment, drawn taut against the skull. The jaw was slack, held in place by what looked like a folded napkin, giving the face a horrifyingly lopsided grin. The eyes were hollow, empty sockets. It was a thing of absolute abject horror, a grotesque mockery of a human being. It was the corpse of Alistair Harrow, 6 weeks decayed. Elara did not scream. She did not cry. Her expression for a fleeting moment was one of simple confusion, as if she couldn't comprehend his presence. Then it hardened into a look of pure possessive fury, the look of a hostess whose private, intimate dinner party has been unforgivably interrupted by a clumsy oaf. She raised a single delicate finger to her lips, a gesture of silencing. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a shout, but a low, chilling whisper that cut through the thick, foul air with the sharpness of glass. "You are interrupting our supper." The quiet, almost polite banality of the sentence, spoken in the face of such unimaginable horror, shattered the last of Thomas's composure. Based on the accounts he later gave to his personal physician in Charleston, he did not confront her. He did not argue or scream. He simply backed out of the room, pulled the doors closed on the ghastly scene, and was violently ill in the hall. The cover-up was swift, ruthless, and absolute. The Harrow and Devereaux family names carried enough weight in Savannah to bury any scandal, no matter how monstrous. That very night, under the deep cover of a moonless sky, Thomas and 2 trusted, tight-lipped men he hired from the city's docks gave Alistair Harrow a second secret burial. They interred him in an unmarked grave at the far edge of the property, beneath an old magnolia tree. The macabre charade was over. Elara was taken from the house the next morning. The story holds that she did not resist. She seemed passive, empty, her intricate delusion having been shattered by the brute force of the outside world. She was like a sleepwalker who had finally been shaken awake, only to find herself in a house of horrors of her own meticulous making. She was quietly escorted to a private sanatorium in the cool, green hills of rural Pennsylvania, a place for the wealthy mentally ill, where she could be discreetly forgotten by Savannah society. Her name was struck from guest lists, her existence relegated to a hushed, cautionary whisper among those who knew the truth. Serenity Fields was sold. Its contents, including the grand mahogany dining table, were auctioned off. The new owners, a family from the north, were unnerved by the persistent local rumors and a faint, phantom smell in the dining room that they could never quite eradicate, no matter how much they scrubbed and aired the house. They sold it again within a year. The house passed through several more hands before it was finally abandoned, left to decay, its history becoming a local ghost story, a tale to frighten children on dark nights. And what of Hattie, the sole silent witness to the entire affair? Her fate is one of history's quiet, unrecorded tragedies. Upon Elara's removal, she became by law the property of Thomas Devereaux. What secret horrors she carried with her, what she saw in her dreams for the rest of her days, is not part of the official record. She, like her former mistress, was a forgotten woman, a footnote in a story that was never her own, her trauma buried beneath the crushing weight of the era. It is easy to dismiss the story of Alistair Harrow as a simple tale of a woman who went mad from grief. But the truth is more complex and far more disturbing. Her story is a uniquely American Gothic tragedy. Born of a specific time and place, she was a woman whose identity was so completely and systematically erased, so thoroughly consumed by her husband's, that his death constituted her own annihilation. Faced with the terror of non-existence, she chose to reject reality itself. She chose to preside over a table of decay rather than face a world in which she, alone, was nothing. Her macabre ritual was not an act of love. It was a desperate, pathological act of self-preservation. By keeping her husband physically present, she could keep her own identity, her own purpose, alive. The dining room at Serenity Fields was more than a tomb. It was a stage. And on it, Alistair Harrow gave the performance of her life, a one-act play for an audience of the dead, proving the chilling truth that the most inescapable darkness is the kind we build for ourselves, one quiet, desperate denial at a time.